One of the more critical skills you'll need for doing well in SAT reading is identifying trap answers. So the way the SAT is going to try to make you get questions wrong is two ways. Number one, they're going to make the right answer seem wrong, right? They're going to make it seem boring, irrelevant, but it will actually end up matching quite well with the passage. And more importantly, they're going to make the wrong answers seem right. They're going to use certain strategies that are rooted in our psychology, in our cognitive biases, to try to draw you to the wrong answers so that you're distracted and you pick something that doesn't end up being right. And they have a very consistent way of creating these answers. So if you're able to identify trap answers, it makes you more likely to avoid them and not get the question wrong. So here's a list of some of the more common trap answers. This is essentially an exhaustive list. Perhaps occasionally there's some little things that come up, but this really does cover most of the trap answers, most of the way they construct wrong answers on the test. So let's run through them, and as we're working through future passages and as you work through future passages, especially in your review period where you're checking your answers, definitely spend time to see how the choices in the questions map onto these different categories. Opposite trap choices are what it sounds like. It's when this is basically the opposite of what you're looking for. So the opposite of the correct interpretation. So imagine the passage makes an argument, let's say, that reading books is old-fashioned and you don't need to read books anymore, you can read blogs. Let's say that's the argument. Maybe one of the choices in a question will be the opposite, that reading books is traditionally a good thing to do and reading blogs isn't as effective, right? So what they'll essentially do is literally take the opposite of what you read. And they do this because sometimes students will read the passage the other way, right? Get the opposite intended meaning of what the author's trying to say, and they'll be more attracted to one of these trap choices as a result. Recycled words. This basically means reusing specific words and phrases in the choices, from the passage, in the choices. Now, on the old SAT, this used to be a much firmer rule where basically I would say if you saw any choices, any words from the passage in the choices, especially very conspicuous, obvious, interesting words repeated in the choices, almost always that choice was wrong. That is not the case anymore, but you can still use this as something to look out for. If they're reusing specific language, specific words, particularly from the passage in the choices, that's usually a bad sign. Not always. I've seen questions where that's right, on easier questions generally, but it is something to look out for. Why does this work? Why do they make this a trap choice? Well, think about it. If you're trying to find an answer to a question and you see the same language appearing in the choices as you did in the passage, you might be more inclined to pick it. But what you're going to find, as we've discussed previously, is that the answers are paraphrases of what's in the passage. So you're looking for a paraphrase or a summary of what was read, not necessarily a word-for-word, one-to-one mirroring of what was actually in the passage. Again, this isn't 100%. There are right answers where they do repeat the words, but it's just something to look out for. If you see a choice repeating the words, be very careful. Half right, all wrong. So typically, it doesn't even have to be half right. It could be mostly right, but only a little bit wrong makes it all wrong. What do I mean by this? So let's say you have a choice. Let's say here's choice A, and here is your choice, right? Here are the words. What you'll typically see, these are some of the more trickier choices, is the first half or so, maybe more, will work, right? Check. That'll fit with what you read in the passage. But then towards the end of the choice, that's where you have your issue. You've got even a single word can make that choice incorrect, right? Even if the first part is great, if the whole thing doesn't work, it's all wrong, right? So what happens on these, why these are so tricky, is students will read this, they'll kind of get sucked into the first part, and either they'll ignore the last part, or they'll rationalize why the last part fits, even though it clearly doesn't, or maybe not so clearly doesn't, but maybe it doesn't fit very well. So you have to take the whole choice into account, not just the first part. Even the first part works. Primarily, you'll also see this in the form of primary. So what is the primary purpose? This portion of the passage primarily serves to, that kind of question. And what you want to be careful here is that you're finding the main or the primary point not something secondary. So, for example, if they say, what is the primary purpose of this passage? Let's say it's a passage about training dogs and the techniques that help with training dogs. So the primary purpose of that passage would be techniques to train dogs, right? Effective techniques for training dogs, that to teach you that. Let's say there was a paragraph in the passage where they talked about specific breeds, right? Different breeds have different needs if you're going to train them. You wouldn't want to pick an answer choice that said, oh, the primary purpose of this passage is to discuss dog breeds, because that's not the main point. Sure, they mentioned it in a paragraph, but that's just one paragraph, and that paragraph is part of the whole. You want to make sure when you see the word primarily or primary that you're getting the main point, not a secondary point, and that it captures the whole of the paragraph or the passage, not just a piece of it. True but wrong. So just because, this is where outside knowledge comes in, just because a choice is correct in terms of the facts or in terms of your opinions or your knowledge doesn't mean it's right if the passage itself doesn't make the point that the choice is making, right? As always, we said this before, the answer's in the text. It's not based on outside knowledge. Could be true but wrong. Kind of related to 5, except this is one where it's kind of too far of an inference beyond the text. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in number 8. But basically, if something, like let's say the passage is talking about reasons why a student doesn't like to do math, right? And let's say the passage goes through all these different reasons why a student doesn't like math. Let's say one of the choices says something having to do with the student not liking science because it has math in it. Right? Maybe the choice says, John doesn't like science because it has math. While that could be true, right? Maybe it's the case that his hatred for math spills over into science, and so he doesn't like science as a result. If the passage never says that, or at least strongly implies it, it's not the answer. No matter how logical or seemingly self-evident that would be, right? Even though it could be true, doesn't mean it's true. Again, with 5 and 6, they're more or less the same thing, and to a certain extent in 8 as well. Stick to the text. The text is what matters. The text is what matters. Right? That's always where you're going to find the answers. 7, not in cited line or wrong passage. So not in cited line, let's say they're citing, we've kind of talked about this before, lines 13 to 15, and you find an answer in line 27, it's not a good sign, right? You want to stick as close as you can to those cited lines. Sometimes you have to go a little bit outside them to get some context, but always the answer's got to be based on what you read in those lines. That context is just going to tell you what's going on in those lines. Wrong passage would be if you're dealing with dual passages. We've talked about this as well, or sometimes they will pull stuff from one passage to make you think they'll pull stuff from passage 2 for a question on passage 1. And of course, it doesn't make any sense. If it's about passage 1, it's about passage 1, not about passage 2. Wild inference, again, related to 5 or 6. This deals specifically with questions where you have to do an imply or infer or suggest type question, right? What does this passage suggest or imply? What can you infer from this? As we've discussed, you're only going to be one step, like one logical step beyond what's in the passage. And often, it's really just a paraphrase or a summary of what you read. It's not even really much of an inference. But even if it were an inference, it's only like one logical step away. It's very hard to talk about this in generalities because we have to see questions. We've seen some already. We're going to see more in the next few sets of videos where we work through some passages. So I'll talk more about it then when we see these questions. A dual passage error, misattributing argument. So typically this is one of those situations where do the passages agree? Do they disagree? And the big issue that students have here, as we've discussed, is they will think the passage disagrees when it actually agrees, or vice versa. And if you make that switch, right, it's related to the first error here, the opposite answers. If you make that switch, if you don't see that they agree or that they disagree properly, it affects a lot of the dual passage questions. So something to be very careful about. And this was reflected in our strategy where we want to take a little bit of time before we go to the dual passage questions to evaluate whether they agree, disagree, or somewhere in between. Extreme or too strong language. We've seen this as well. Choices that are too strong or use too extreme language, when that extreme language is not clearly supported by the text, cannot be the answer. So some example words to look out for are words like always, all, never, none, completely, utterly, right? Words like that, right? Where it's totalizing, where it's overgeneralizing. Not that extreme choices can't be correct. They can be, but you have to have very clear evidence in the text, and that's usually why they're wrong, because if the evidence is that obvious, the question isn't very hard, so they typically don't make extreme choices be correct for that reason. Again, just like with recycled words, you can't immediately eliminate a choice that looks like an extreme choice, but you have to be very careful with it. And then finally, the catch-all category, basically everything else, a choice that doesn't seem to have anything to do with the passage or anything to do with the cited lines. I just call that irrelevant, right? It's not in the text. Doesn't seem to be relevant to the question. It's not so much a trap. It's more just there as filler, right? As just a generic distractor. So typically you're not going to fall for those, but they are there, so be aware. All right, that's it for our trap choices. Let's move on to talking a little bit more about specific question types.